I do want to welcome you on behalf of the Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good at Regent College, and on behalf of the Theology and the Arts program at Regent College, which is co-sponsoring this event happily.
How much?
For those of you who aren't new to the Houston Center, it is an interdisciplinary forum directed by Jan Zimmerman that draws leading scholars into theologically significant dialogue about human personhood and common life. My name is Jonathan Anderson. I'm the Eugene and Jan Peterson Associate Professor of Theology and the Arts at Regent College. And it is such a pleasure to be welcoming Ben Quash to speak to us tonight. A scholar for whom I have great admiration and affection, really. If I can say that. This won't be too gushy. Let's hope. And someone who is certainly one of the leading lights working at the intersections of theology and the arts. His lecture tonight is titled Shared Delight, Art as Common Ground, which will be followed by a response by Dr. Evan Freeman, and then some conversation. I'll introduce Ben now and come back up after his talk to introduce Evan in good time. And then toward the end, there will be time for a conversation and questions from all of you, so you can be formulating those questions along the way in a concise and targeted way. And make use of the microphone that will be roving when the time comes. Ben Quash is the Professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's College London, where he leads one of the leading programs and research centers for theology and the arts. And the students that they produce there are remarkable people. Ben's program at King's works in tight partnership with the National Gallery in London, and it's home to the massive and truly stunning visual commentary on Scripture project, which was launched in 2018 and is expanding every year, and perhaps we'll hear something about that tonight. And Ben is Professor Quash is the founding editor and director of the VCS, and you can check that out at thevcs.org. Quash is also the author of several books, including Found Theology, History, Imagination, and the Holy Spirit. That's one book. Theology and the Drama of History, and Abiding, which was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book of 2013. He's edited several other books, including, most recently, Theology, Modernity, and the Visual Arts, which he co-edited with Chloe Redaway, that just came out this year. And he's author of dozens of important articles and chapters that are significant to my field, and not just my field. The range is quite stunning. Prior to going to King's in 2007, Quash held a few faculty positions at the University of Cambridge, including chaplain and fellow of Fitzwilliam College, lecturer in the Cambridge Theological Federation, the dean and fellow of Peterhouse, and the academic director of the Cambridge Interfaith Program in the Faculty of Divinity, where he developed research and public education programs that helped to establish the practice and theory of scriptural reasoning, if you're familiar with that organization. And I jammed a whole bunch of those credentials all together, but yeah, you can visit his bio and sort out the order for those. And on a more personal note, Professor Quash was my doctoral supervisor and was someone from whom I learned so much. And he intuitively understood what I was doing at a deep level and gave guidance with wisdom and kindness. for which I'm forever grateful and hope to pass on from him through me, we say. So Ben, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Quash.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's such a gracious welcome and introduction. It's really a delight to be in Vancouver, and I'm grateful to Jens Zimmerman, whose work I've admired for a long time, but who I only met the first time yesterday. For all the work that Regent does, I'm deeply grateful, and I'm particularly excited about the work in theology and the arts, which has been a part of Regent's life since its inception, but is flourishing. It seems to me, and some of the conversations I've had this evening have given me so much encouragement and delight. So it's great to see what's happening here, and I hope we'll continue to work closely between London and Vancouver as we shape this field, this ever-growing and always exciting field. This is not just shameless advertising, it's because I'm going to talk later on about a work of art, a particular work of art. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but if you did want to play around in Zoom and see it in high resolution, if you had a mobile device, you might want to get the web page opened up, and then I'll tell you where to find it when we reach that point in the lecture. So it's a kind of tool that might give you an even more enhanced experience of one of the key works that I want to speak about. A work which lives in London but has visited Vancouver. That's a little bit of a clue. But let me begin. Actually, we won't come to that quite yet. So, in this lecture, I'm going to ask what role shared delight in the arts might play in helping us to think afresh about public truth and the common good. In an era where notions of shared truth, goodness, and beauty are under suspicion, it's essential that our common humanity be articulated with reference to our shared longings, what St. Augustine would have called common objects of love. Celebrated formula. And with reference to our shared longings, even across religious or ideological divides. And the arts are indispensable toward this end. Two key premises are at work in what follows. First, I believe, with Thomas Aquinas, and no doubt many others, that the desire for happiness is a fundamental driving force of human existence, though only fulfilled by grace, in what must finally be an eschatological consummation. To put this another way, heavenly beatitude is the fitting end of creation, but is at the same time in excess of it. And second, I believe that true eschatological happiness takes the form of being in common, in ways which we may see only through a glass darkly for now, but which are genuinely intimated to us in this worldly experience. One of the great dilemmas of the modern period is our loss of faith in the relationship between the good, the true, and the beautiful. Our ancestors in pre-modern times, by which I mean pre-16th century times, assumed a continuity between them, but we now habitually doubt it. There are many reasons for this onset of doubt, but a significant one is the increased tendency of us moderns to locate concepts like beauty in the eye of the beholder, in our own minds and sensibilities, rather than out there, as it were, in an objective order of things, and to assume that the inner and the outer must be in tension in some way. On this divided account, something is beautiful for us rather than beautiful in itself, and there cannot be any intrinsic link between the beautiful and the good or the true. Only the arbitrary associations I choose to make between things I like and things I value without any appeal to their existence independently of me. What makes us and our dilemmas so very different from those of the medieval period, for example, is that medieval people, including the most brilliant intellectuals of those centuries, thought that beauty and goodness and truth were transcendental realities. That is to say, they were intrinsic and necessary aspects of each existent thing insofar as that thing participated in the being and purpose which God gave it. The true, the good, and the beautiful were properties of all created being. And being is not something we make or guarantee. Being is made by and guaranteed from somewhere else, by another. If that creative guaranteeing other, if you can see my text, it would be a capital A for another and a capital O for the guaranteeing other. If that creative guaranteeing other is a good God, then whatever is also good, true, and desirable, which is to say attractive or beautiful, by virtue of its existing at all. For anything to be is for it to be from the self-communicating goodness of God. Being and beauty are thus inseparable, mutually convertible, and are grounded together with the true and the good in God, who is ultimate reality. And this is the sort of idea that we find emerging in the work of the mystical writer Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, writing in about 500. And you see it here. Beauty is the great creating cause which bestirs the world and holds all things in existence. It is the cause toward which all things move, since it is the longing for beauty which brings them into existence. The beautiful is the same as the good, for everything looks to the beautiful and the good as the cause of being, and there is nothing in the world without a share of the beautiful and the good. This, the one, the good, the beautiful, is in its uniqueness the cause of the multitudes of the good and the beautiful. Hans-Georg Gadamer, in his masterpiece Truth and Method, begins his intellectual survey of modern hermeneutics at the point of the collapse of faith in this transcendental relationship between the good, the true, and the beautiful. It is in this context that he traces the rise of modern natural scientific method as a search for, and I quote, ironclad conclusions, and analyses what he sees as the profoundly destructive consequences of modelling all forms of knowledge on those most prized by the natural sciences, as conceived in modernity. The specifically human sciences find themselves contorting or betraying themselves in order to justify their status at this bar as reliable sources of truth or moral guidance. It's important to note that Gadamer is not seeking to rehabilitate the medieval metaphysics of convertible transcendentals. Such claims belong in a theological framework, and his is an enterprise that stops short of theology, though it is not hostile to it. But what he does affirm is a profound communicative reciprocity in the world. He affirms the idea that our reality is shared and that communicability is a sort of medium in which we live, move, and have our being, larger and more encompassing than any individual viewpoint. Gadamer calls this the hermeneutic universe. In an appreciative exposition of the Italian Enlightenment philosopher Giambattista Vico's thought, Gadamer develops further his idea that a medium of shareable imaginative instincts and judgments is the condition for fruitful, wise, and virtuous life. And I quote, "What gives the human will its direction is not the abstract universality of reason, but the concrete universality represented by the community of a group, a people, a nation, or the whole human race. Hence, developing this communal sense is of decisive importance for living." This medium has been called the sensus communis by a long line of thinkers, a term that is only inadequately translated the common good, because it denotes the workings of a shared subjectivity rather than some objective order of things. It is acquired by living in the community, but its exercise also feeds constructively into that community's structures, aims, and ideas of itself. There is a reciprocity between the organic life of the whole and the constructive involvement of individual participants. In this mediation between individuals and a more encompassing whole, the sensus communis as Gadamer puts it, is, and I quote, the sense that founds community. Gadamer shows that an idea of the sensus communis retained a foothold even in Immanuel Kant's thought, that supreme architect of modern Enlightenment reason. But in Kant's estimation, it was in the domain of aesthetics alone that we could still encounter it. I quote, from the whole range of what could be called a sense faculty of judgment, for Kant only the judgment of aesthetic taste is left. Gadamer observes, the true sense of community for Kant is taste. Taste is the residual locus of communal sense. Admittedly, Kant's restriction only to aesthetics of what had once been something far more encompassing, extending to our judgments about morality, the good, and about truth, marks a retreat of sorts, and is the correlate of an energetic attempt to put our relationships to truth and goodness on a wholly different footing from that to beauty, one based in universal concepts from which actual cases, rather than offering enrichment and expansion, always detract in some way. The real world is in some ways always a disappointment in relation to the universal ideas. But it could be that this last redoubt of the sensus communis, not abandoned by Kant, aesthetic, is something from which one could build back better, to borrow a phrase. Indeed, I believe that this is part of Gadamer's own project, which starts with the ontology of the artwork in order to develop a full-blown hermeneutics. And that in English-speaking philosophy, a little ahead of Gadamer, is also given good foundations in the work of one of my favourite English philosophers, R.G. Collingwood, who, in treating The Principles of Art, which is the title of one of his best books, published in the late 1930s, lays the ground for a full-blown metaphysic. More of Collingwood, a little bit more of Collingwood later. So for both these thinkers, Collingwood and Gadamer, the domain of aesthetics is a profoundly communal one, which doesn't have to travel by way of the formulation of universal laws, which are the production of the intellect and use of conceptual tools. There is a wholeness to things, which we access through our subjectivity, not by supposedly escaping from it, and thus also through the particularities of the encounters that we have with the world around us. By the same token, the world is not reducible to our subjective experience of it. That is, to our subjectivity alone. In the reaffirmation, in the realm of aesthetics, of a domain between the universal, valid for everyone, supposedly, and the individual, valid for me, Collingwood and Gadamer see a pathway for an account of how the good and the true, too, are better understood as things we know in common. We know them in the midst of history, never exhaustively, with infallible certainty, as though from a God's eye point of view, but with a conviction that warrants confident commitment to them in recognition that they have a binding force. Gadamer remarks that just as, and I quote, both taste and judgment evaluate the object in relation to a whole in order to see whether it fits in with everything else, so also our knowledge of law and morality is always supplemented by the individual case. So the individual case is not a disappointment for Gadamer, it's a supplementation of what we know. Even indeed, he says, productively determined by the individual case. Law, like law, he says, morality is constantly developed through the fecundity of the individual case. Thus, judgment, as the evaluation of the beautiful and sublime, is by no means productive only in the area of nature and art. One cannot even say, with Kant, that the productivity of judgment is to be found chiefly in this area. Rather, the beautiful in nature and art is to be supplemented by the whole ocean of the beautiful, spread throughout the moral reality of mankind. In other words, the things that give us shared delight include those we deem beautiful for their moral appropriateness. They have a fittingness which we discern and evaluate with the help of our faculties of judgment, just as we do works of art or features of the natural world. Yet this must be done by relating one's partial perspectives to an intuited whole, rather than, as Kant supposes when he turns from the aesthetic to the moral, by deriving and proving one's judgment from, quote, a universal principle. It involves, in Gadamer's words, keeping oneself open to what is other. I quote again, the universal viewpoints to which the cultivated man, the gebildet person, keeps himself open are not a fixed, applicable yardstick, but are present to him only as the viewpoints of possible others. This is a different way of conceiving the universal, a totality with something of an organic quality to it, which both grounds our affirmations and may also correct them. To recall Gadamer's own way of putting it, this is concrete universality, not abstract universality. Our task in the meantime, with something that my wife is also a theologian, Susanna Ticciati, is called fallible commitment, is to stake ourselves in our judgments while being ready to have them supplemented and changed by others. It is very different from a universality that takes one outside and above this whole, affording some sort of ahistorical overview of it. At this point, I want to make room for an art historical excursus. In fact, more than excursus, it will probably take us pretty much all the way to the end of the paper, which I hope will exemplify some of these claims in some more vivid ways. I will look at one of the most celebrated works of art in Western Protestant modernity, William Pullman Hunt's The Light of the World. This is the painting made in 3 versions, first in 1853, and its final for Keble College in Oxford, and in its third and final version in 1900, made much bigger and with the help of an assistant, for St. Paul's Cathedral. But this St. Paul's version is the one that travelled around the then empire, the Christian parts of the empire, as it was put, beginning in Canada. It travelled, landed in Nova Scotia and travelled progressively in 1905. So it's nearly, what would it be, the 120th anniversary of its arrival in Canada, progressively across to Vancouver, and then carried on its journey to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and then eventually back to the UK. And apparently something like 7 million people turned out to see it. The queues of people, wherever it went, were enormous. Now, if you do want to look at the Keble College version, and you clicked on the QR code at the beginning, you need to go to the New Testament section of the VCS and look for Matthew chapter 7. And that's an exhibition called Knock and the Door Will Be Opened to You, and you'll find a zoomable high-resolution version of the Keble one. So if you want to play around with that as I'm speaking, please do. But this is the St. Paul's version, which is just back on show after having been removed for some time because of building works. I want to use this painting as a case study of how a work of art might direct us to a more than only aesthetic communal sense, to larger questions of goodness and truth, of how in fact art might convert us, because in some ways this is a painting about conversion, Pullman Hunt's own conversion, but something more general and shareable and communal indeed than that. Hunt pointed to his own conversion to Christianity as an inspiration for the original painting, and the painting in turn seems to invite a converting response, letting Christ in. The idea that a work of visual art might work in this way is interesting in itself, especially outside those Roman Catholic and Orthodox traditions of Christianity, in which thaumaturgical images perform miracles and icons mediate the living presence of sacred persons. Hunt's composition provokes the question of whether conversion can be aesthetically catalysed. If so, does Hunt's work in any or all of its 3 versions embody an aesthetic that lends itself to that purpose? To ask such a question requires historical alertness. aesthetic tastes change. And to ask such a question with specifically 21st century audiences in mind requires the recognition that it is not only aesthetic tastes that change, but other sorts of value too. Contemporary Western audiences may well have mixed reactions to the idea of conversion encounters. In particular, conversion to Christ will, in many of the political and intellectual circles that are influential in contemporary public discourse, seem ethically dubious, if not alarmingly retrograde. It will suggest conformity to a tradition of belief and practice whose history is singularly marked by hegemonic tendencies, the appropriation or destruction of rival traditions, the supersessionist imposition of its own doctrinal and ethical systems on reluctant others, and alliance with imperialist military and economic interests at every historical opportunity. Closer to home, conversion, whether to Christ or not, will sound to many like a close cousin of abuse. This is perhaps because it is so much at odds with the models of selfhood we've come to take for granted in Western modernity. Models in which the self is buffered, in Charles Taylor's now familiar description, autonomous and self-actualizing. As the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa puts it in his acclaimed recent book Resonance, this model of selfhood results in, and I quote, a privatization of the good, which we reify in everyday practice, wherever we affirm that everyone must know for themselves what they want to make of themselves and their lives. If our most fundamental identities are regarded as being entirely our own to determine, then a summons to be other than we think we are, and whose origin is from somewhere or someone else, seems unconscionable, a violation. Conversion is of its nature a denial of the valorization of private experience, which underwrites the contemporary practice and politics of self-attestation. Yet such objections to the work, 170 years after it was first painted, are not ones you hear very often. It might be that, as a work of, inverted commas, Christian art, the light of the world is more ignored than critiqued by those for whom Christianity is objectionable. Its message would be profoundly disturbing to audiences if they thought about it, but it cannot disturb unless it first commands public attention. And command attention in the buzzing marketplace of 21st century art consumption, Hunt's work does not, for all its enduring popularity in some quarters. It would no longer draw record-breaking crowds if it went on a world tour. Those critiques that remain lively are more likely to be from people who are sympathetic to Christianity, but uncomfortable with this work's particular way of manifesting Christianity's supposed appeal. For many such critics, the light of the world imbues a scene of one-to-one encounter between Jesus and me with an atmosphere of consoling intimacy that fails to invite the transformation of self that is a necessary part of Christian discipleship. This is, among others, the critique that I've heard Rowan Williams advance of this painting. The irony here is that an admittedly imagined secular critic of the work in 2024 would object to its offering an invitation to conversion at all, while a common Christian theological criticism of the painting is that it does not ask for nearly enough by way of conversion. Arguably, though, a reading of the light of the world as cheaply consoling depends upon an inattention to the deeper claims it is making. The Jesus Christ of this painting does not draw near to some private interior of the self in order simply to commune with it as he finds it. That might be a welcome reading when judged by the 21st century principles that I have just outlined, and one that would bring very little disturbance in its wake. But there is a logic embedded in the painting's subject matter, and I would argue in its very composition, that unsettles any pretensions to self-possession we might have. It does invite metanoia, turning and transformation, and it experiments aesthetically with how that invitation might transmit itself in visual terms. This logic, if discerned, would inevitably be disturbing to many contemporary viewers, though, as I hope to show, it is not the logic of invasive coercion, nor does it entail the erasure of selfhood. But it should also disturb the critique of the light of the world's Christian denigrators. Carefully considered, the work seems to want to dispose us differently from the ways we may previously have sought to dispose ourselves, though without violence. And this new disposal of ourselves will have more than private consequences. I will propose in what follows that, on the one hand, The Light of the World is a work that can help secular 21st century viewers to consider whether the buffered self is less a prize to be jealously guarded than it is a condition of burdensome alienation. And on the other hand, in response to those who decry the painting's individualism, perhaps seeing in it a precursor to, rather than a remedy for, contemporary ills, I will argue that it can be read in line with a richer and more complex theological account of how the private, or inner, and public, or outer worlds of human thought and experience are related in Christ. Indeed, how they are not as opposed as we have been trained to think. For at the very moment it invites us to open a deeper pathway within ourselves, we are simultaneously brought into the luminosity of the true light that lightens everyone. John chapter 1 verse 9. And to become seers of far more than the interiors of our own hearts. I did wonder in writing this whether my lecture would have better been entitled Shared Light rather than Shared Delight. The aesthetic opening up that we experience in the first instance quickly reveals itself, in line with the metaphor of light I just borrowed from John's Gospel, as also an opening up to the source of our deepest happiness, a happiness to which God's delightful gifts of truth and goodness are also intrinsic. It is thus a more radical painting than it seems, with more radical things to offer to both of the groups of critics I've identified. And I say this as someone who's always, for many decades, disliked the work, but who, in preparing to write about it, found myself, rather to my surprise, somewhat converted to it. Taking compositional decisions as a key part of the work's aesthetic, as an aesthetic in service of metanoia, I will read it in conversation with a small selection of other works of visual art, some by Pullman Hunt himself, but beginning with one that postdates him. The late Norman Adams, who died in 2005, was from 1986 to 1995 Keeper of Paintings at the Royal Academy in London. His 1997 work, Vision on the Road to Damascus, which you see here, a huge work, more than 6 feet high, is now part of a private collection. I wanted to show the lower part, actually. I'm not sure I've got that here. Just look at the lower part there. In the lower half of the composition, Saul's head is depicted on its side. Long fingers shield it as its cavernous eyes stare blindly out at us. And then in the gold-drenched upper half, we discern a radiant heavenly face, with blue flowers for eyes, weeping with compassion, and sending out penetrating rays of light, which are just beginning to find a way through the tight outer fingers of the agonized head below. This second face is, of course, Christ's. It makes an intriguing partner for the light of the world, insofar as it is, like Hunt's work, an exploration of conversion, or more accurately, of what precedes conversion. For in neither work are we shown obvious signs of the convert's positive response. One intriguing feature they have in common, despite all the differences between Hunt's painstakingly precise verisimilitude and Adams's semi-abstract experimentation with bright colours and elemental shapes, is that the crown of thorns on Christ's head in the Adams, so I'll get back there, is itself shown converted. On Christ's head, there is a crown not of thorns, but of brightly coloured, lozenge-like leaf forms. Why? One answer that's been suggested is that these thorns' eons-long evolution from leaves into weaponized spikes has been set in reverse by the action of Christ, who, while suffering their cruelty, wears them in love. They are drawn back to their first innocence and are redeemed into life, into gentleness. It's also quite possible that in treating the thorns in this way and opening space for this theological interpretation of their transformation, Adams was quoting the light of the world, in which Hunt shows the thorns in Christ's crown becoming regenerate as tender green living foliage. You can see it there. Not dead thorns, but now bearing soft leaves for the healing of the nations, as John Ruskin noted. To extend the comparison between the two compositions, we can read Saul's strangely root-like fingers as like the overgrown doorway. Sorry, jumping ahead there. Choked with weeds. Let's go back to the last page. In Hunt's work, and the runnels of water from Christ's eyes in Adams's work, and the shafts of light which emerge from almost lantern-like apertures in the heavens as modes of Christ's knocking. Well, now to a second work, which I gave you a preview of just now, in this case also by Hunt. The Awakening Conscience, also 1853, so the same year that he painted the original Light of the World. Hunt described it as, quote, a material representation of the idea in the light of the world. His intention was to show how this, and this is quoting him, to show how the still small voice speaks to a human soul in the turmoil of life. A young woman leaps from her lover's lap as the realization of a different possibility of life dawns in her eyes. In place of the impenetrable enclosed door of the light of the world, we see here, in the reflection in the mirror behind the woman, a pair of transparent and open doors leading to a garden or orchard bathed in sunlight. Night is now day, the light has reached her, and she moves towards it in response. In this case, the pairing of the light of the world with another of Hunt's works is not just part of an art historical investigative strategy, but was Hunt's own evident intention. The two pictures functioned in Hunt's mind as something like a diptych, even though they were not displayed together physically. For him, these works were a pair that, when considered together, could, and I quote, furnish an image of the ways Christ and his grace affect human life. Considered in this way, the awakening is consequent upon the initial approach of the one who calls. More than that, it is dependent upon this approach, thus safeguarding the principle that salvation originates with the Saviour. Nevertheless, the activating power of this call is not merely external to the hearer, like the light that streams in through French windows, knocking on the door of her heart, but at the same time internal to her, such that her response to it can also be counted her ownmost act. The God who creates us and who calls us also creates the conditions for our response. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's words seem apposite at this point. From the moment I recognise that my experience, precisely insofar as it is my own, makes me accessible to what is not myself, then I am sensitive to the world and to others, and all the beings which objective thought placed at a distance draws singularly near to me. Or conversely, I recognise my affinity with them. I am nothing but an ability to echo them, to understand them, to respond to them. These words offer a challenge to the prevalent modern assumption that our inner worlds of experience are always private and bound to set us apart from others. And this useful challenge can be extended to address the worry, sometimes expressed, that Hunt's vision of encounter with Christ, whether in the light of the world or in its companion piece, The Awakening Conscience, is too individualized. I do not think that that is an obvious or inevitable conclusion, especially given that it is displayed publicly, and that insofar as anyone can read the work, what they discern is therefore also public. A brief return to Norman Adams' vision on the road to Damascus may help us here. the head of Saul in Adams's painting is also the Word. I think the painting invites us to make an intertextual move. Sorry, I'm getting a bit messed up with my slides. It invites us to make an intertextual move from Saul's experience, as testified to 3 times in the book of Acts, to Paul's words in the letter to the Romans. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Adams invites us to see Paul's head, Paul's head, painted in blacks and browns, other than its red lips, as a huge groaning earth in travail. Part of what this painting is doing is showing us the cry of this earth, this world of ours, by making it look out at us through Saul's face. Adams has discerned, I believe, that when the later Paul talks of the earth as being in darkness and awaiting a liberation into light, into a new awareness and a new fruitfulness, this description of the earth is also an autobiographical description. It is both cosmic and personal. The earth after the fall, the earth that groans in travail, confronts us in this painting with and in Paul. And there ought to be no serious obstacle to interpreting the soul whose door is knocked on in the light of the Word, or the conscience that is awakened in its companion painting, as representing more than those of a single individual in each case. Just as in the Song of Songs, the bride has been read for centuries as both a human lover and the church, so Hunt's human protagonists can simultaneously be received both as particular persons and as ecclesial communities. Indeed, potentially, they can be viewed as representing the fallen world as a whole. Hunt stated that his pair of paintings were, and I quote, 2 images of the same happening, each of which allows the spectator to perceive that event from a different perspective. The first from the vantage point of eternity, and the second from a specific historical moment, and thus to create an art that represents the way the eternal, the divine, enters human history. That the knock is located in eternity implies that the response, located in human history, is an instance of something with an indefinite number of analogues, all different, but all examples, in their different ways, of the same happening, to use his word. We see just one conversion, but in this vision we are vouchsafed a glimpse of what could be, perhaps already is, ours, as it was Hunt's. We are seeing something that is known, thus knowable, and experienced, thus experienceable, in common. If we find this problematic, then we confront an issue that afflicts much modern discourse about how the inward and the outward, the individual and her wider public world, relate. It is widely supposed that in each case the 2 terms of this polarity will be at odds. But this is an unnecessary and disabling opposition. True knowledge is both inward and public. In De Magistro, St. Augustine concludes that we do far better if we understand ourselves not as spectators of the world from some assumed and supposedly neutral distance, seeking to eliminate the influence of a subjectivity that we fear will be distorting, but rather as participants in it. We come to know things most truly by our personal inhabitation of the world. Others do the same, and as joint participants in the world, our knowledge of it is shareable with them, as theirs is with us. We can then explore and test it alongside others. Thus, our personal, inverted commas, inward knowledge and experience are not private. On the contrary, they are our indispensable portal to publicly shared truths. Subjectivity is no hindrance to objective knowledge, it is the means to it. In conversation with his father, Augustine's son Adeodatus comes to see that, quote, when Christ spoke externally, he reminded us that he was dwelling within. Christ is the truth in whom we participate when we engage in learning. This truth is something given to us to hold in common. And this is an inversion of the modern assumption that the mind contains thoughts that are constructions of a world that is external to itself. On the contrary, when we think thoughts that are greater than us. We join in with them as the shared truth, which is a necessary condition for there being a public world at all. This, however, can only happen when we think from somewhere as particular subjects. So when we encounter the thought as also the experience of another, our challenge is not to extract what was supposedly in their head or their heart, so that we can to some limited degree appropriate it too. It is to try to investigate and grasp what they were in touch with in their thinking and feeling, and when successful, to find ourselves in common with them in the shared enterprise of being co-seekers after truth. Thus, for example, Augustine believes that he can share, through his subjectivity, in the truths that Moses also perceived through his subjectivity, without having to look into Moses' mind in some way. And Collingwood offered a 20th century corollary to this in his claim that we can think the thought, and indeed feel the feeling, of another, without in any particular respect having to eliminate our own subjecthood and somehow impossibly be them. If we encounter someone else's thoughts or feelings, and I quote, prepared with an experience sufficiently like theirs, we find that we are able to understand the thoughts of our fellow person by reenacting, a key word for Collingwood, reenacting them in ourselves. The implications of this argument for whether or not we reject the supposed privacy of the experience that Hunt communicates to us in the light of the world will, I hope, be apparent. The impression that the door is the door of one heart ought not to alienate us or lead to the conclusion that no other heart is or could be addressed in the painting. What would knocking on a general heart look like? That this is someone's heart is what enables the painting's message to be a genuinely public one. To consider conversion in this light, and with 1 Corinthians 12, as a spiritual gift, by which God arranges the members in the body, each one of them, requires an appreciation of its dynamics that challenges the intellectual habits of our time. Far from being invasive or coercive, conversion can be conceived as an opening outwards onto a larger shared truth, in fuller relationship with others, just as the French windows open outwards in the awakening conscience, and Christ waits in the open air outside the door at which he knocks in the light of the world. Incidentally, the sense of this outdoors being a communal space is subliminally reinforced by the fact, and it's an odd fact when you think about it, that Christ knocks at the door but looks at us. It's not as simple as that we are the addressees of the knock, though that might be part of how the painting seeks to dispose us. Additionally, Hunt invites us to experiment with the possibility that with his help, we might be visionaries ourselves. In an earlier and well-established artistic tradition, the seer of Revelation, John of Patmos, is a distinct figure within the artwork. In the Getty Apocalypse, which you see here, for example, the boundary between vision and visionary is open but robust, so he's bending down to peek through a kind of squint at the vision. And in Hans Memling's St. John altarpiece, it is significantly dematerialized but still in place. But in Hunt's work, it has dissolved altogether, along with the boundary between us, the seers of the seer in the earlier works, and the seer himself. We are not asked to look at a seer, but asked to be one. The scene extends, you have to remember this is a painting partly about the book of Revelation, that I stand at the door and knock. The scene extends to embrace us as the John of Patmos, of this revelatory event, who is both addressee of it and witness of it to others. And this has the effect of catching us up into the drama of Christ's apocalyptic approach towards us, adopting the role of one whom earlier artists only showed us from a distance as one other than ourselves. If so, then we might say that Hunt's compositional and thus aesthetic decisions have created a visual disorientation that looses viewers from their own security in where they stand, and implicates them in the thoughts and visions of others. As Moses was to Augustine, so John of Patmos becomes to us, one who asks us to join him in seeking what he himself was after. The phenomenal popularity of Hunt's work, seen, or in the past at least, seems to offer evidence that in its power to command the attention and the emotions, the minds and the hearts of global audiences, and to have transformative effects on them, it was functioning as far more than a visual record of one person's own conversion experience. Moreover, it was inviting a response of aesthetic judgment that refused to obey Kant's bracketing off of taste from epistemology and ethics. To come face to face with this Christ through art was, and maybe still is, to find oneself in the presence of a living agent, seeking a response from all who will be open to him, asking for a commitment of the whole self in its knowing and willing, as well as in its delighting faculties, and offering a happiness rooted in a new quality of relationship with him and through him with others. So let me make some very short remarks in conclusion. Hans Urs von Balthasar famously argued in the opening volume of The Glory of the Lord, subtitled Seeing the Form, that without beauty we cannot have truth or goodness either. Our experience of beauty is the assurance of a shared, coherent world. This lecture suggested that we can rehabilitate a normative approach to questions of truth and goodness in the public sphere by analogy with an affirmation of aesthetic experience as something that is in principle shareable and that testifies to a world in common. Such testimony can be confident while also open to development and correction, and does not need to ground itself in concepts shorn of historical particularity. Attention to how we enjoy beauty can help us better to appreciate how to have confidence in our shared capacities for meeting in truth and goodness too. In Ticciati's words, the truth, precisely as inward, is something we contemplate together, rather than something we harbour in the privacy of our separate minds. Learning, rather than being about a transaction between separate, externalised minds, is precisely about this communal contemplation of the truth. Hunt's The Light of the World may not seem much of a revolutionary work. It's become too much like cultural wallpaper. But it is a work that unapologetically celebrates the transformative possibility of healing resonance in human lives. 21st century people live in insatiable anticipation of digital knocks on their door that will reassure them that they are connected to a meaningful and loving reality greater than themselves. Hartmut Rosa writes, "There can be little doubt that people use screens and digital media in order to establish contact with others, and in this way secure a new relationship to the world. And so it is no wonder that we jump at every vibration of our smartphone in our pocket, as every incoming message represents a call from the world. But this knocking, though it promises much, yields little. The screen has become a kind of bottleneck," writes Rosa, "through which our experience and appropriation of the world plays out, leading to a potential uniformity of our relationship with the world. And online life is just one sphere of such deadening uniformity. By contrast, as Rosa argues, there are other and better knocks at our door, to which we might attend, which can and do fulfill their promise. When we fall head over heels in love, are overcome by music, a transformative idea, or an experience of the natural world. In such cases, when we can no longer help but give in to a call, it will seem initially that we have lost control over our circumstances. But as Hunt knew, and as his most famous work sought to assure us, it is precisely in such moments that we are not alienated. In this way, the Light of the World's message remains profoundly hopeful and perhaps as topical as ever. Even in spheres where Christ goes unacknowledged, the deepest needs of humans can assert themselves in the form of the longing to be visited by something more enduringly good and true than present circumstances offer. And this longing can be understood theologically as already an advent. To such longing, Hunt's painting holds out a sacramental offer. It is a sign in the visible world whose intention is to witness to the invisible but unbanishable workings of divine grace.
Our respondent will be Dr. Evan Freeman. He is the Hellenic Canadian Congress of BC Chair in Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. His research focuses on art and ritual of the Byzantine Empire and cross-cultural interactions in the wider medieval world. He completed his PhD in the history of art at Yale University and then held postdoctoral fellowships, multiple of them, including the Andrew Mellon Fellowship at Smart History and an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellowship at the University of Regensburg, Germany. Before joining Simon Fraser University, he taught at Queens College, City University of New York, and Portland State University. He's been a prolific contributor to Smart History, especially, which is an online platform that publishes really excellent work. And you can read many of his articles there, so do check them out there. And you're also able to find a lot of his work at Khan Academy and other digital and public humanities projects. Please join me in welcoming Evan Freeman.
Tell me if I'm too quiet. I should also add that you can find a few of my little pieces at the Visual Commentary on Scripture as well, so we'll steer you back there. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. Thank you, Jens, for the invitation. Thank you especially to Dr. Quash for the really great, stimulating talk. You probably got the sense from the introduction. I'm an art historian, which means I was very grateful for the art historical excursus that took up much of your talk. I feel most comfortable when there are images behind me. So tonight I want to focus on some of the artworks you talked about, hopefully put them into a fruitful conversation with some of the artworks that I study. I have a few general questions that I'll get to at the end, which are not meant to imply that Ben has overlooked anything, but since I have you here, I want to pose them to you and hear what you have to say. I'm a historian of the art of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, which ended in 1453. So William Holman Hunt's The Light of the World is a little outside of my area of expertise. But as it so happens, I recently mentioned Hunt's painting in a chapter that I'm contributing to an edited volume on Eastern Orthodox architecture in the contemporary world. In this chapter, I wrote about St. Martin's Anglican Church in North Vancouver, which was founded in 1910, but which unfortunately folded during the pandemic. Now, the former Church of St. Martin's is being used by a local Eastern Orthodox community, which is installed on a anastasis and celebrates the Divine Liturgy in this space every Sunday. William Holman Hunt's Light of the World is reproduced in a large stained glass window that was dedicated in 1952 in the church name. Its presence in a 20th century church here in Vancouver, in the Vancouver area, testifies to its wide reach and its lasting popularity. But today, Orthodox icons hung on the walls of the church flank the stained glass reproduction of Hunt's painting on either side. After hearing your talk, Dr. Quash, tonight, I've concluded that this juxtaposition of Hunt's Light of the World with the Orthodox icons is a fitting one. In Hunt's painting, as Dr. Quash has observed, Christ knocks at the door, but looks at us. In other words, he breaks the fourth wall, or I suppose he knocks on the fourth wall. The frontal orientation and outward gaze of the figure is one of the defining formal characteristics of Byzantine icons. These sacred portraits were intended to bring the viewer into a face-to-face encounter with the holy figure represented, to, quote, mediate the living presence of sacred persons, as Dr. Quash has already alluded to in this talk tonight. These aesthetic or formal qualities, which have made the format of the Byzantine icon so effective and so enduring, were also, according to modern art historians, part of what made them so potentially dangerous from the perspective of those who sought to curtail their use during the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries. Icons and other artworks do have agency. They can serve as catalysts, as you put it tonight. As a scholar whose research tends to focus on art in ritual settings, I'm an adamant believer that context matters. Byzantine art historians have long recognized this. In the middle of the 20th century, the Austrian art historian Otto Damas described the monumental mosaics that occupied the many curved and faceted surfaces of Middle Byzantine churches as spatial icons. According to Damas, the holy figures in these spatial icons were positioned to appear as if they were in dialogue with one another across the space of the church. So, in contrast with Renaissance paintings that treated the picture plane as a window into an illusionistic space beyond the viewer, the figures in Byzantine spatial icons seemed to occupy the same space as the worshippers who gathered in the church. They broke the fourth wall. This makes me wonder about the setting in which translated world is viewed, but as you noted, there are three versions of this image. One located in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, another in Keble College in Oxford, and a third located in Manchester City Art Gallery. How does viewing these paintings in these different settings change how the viewer experiences them? In the St. Paul's Cathedral version, the version you referenced in your talk here tonight, we can see that the painting has been set within an ostentatious gilded frame that incorporates architectural elements, including two pilasters on the right and left, and an architrave over the top. This architectural frame, which was the work of two female artists, Hilda Hewlett and certain Miss Smith, gives the impression that the viewer is seeing Christ through a window or door frame, perhaps the open door of Hunt's own conversion. Additionally, the St. Paul's Cathedral version is sometimes displayed as part of an altarpiece, which itself is equipped with doors that can be closed to hide the painting or opened to reveal it. When displayed as part of this altarpiece, one views Hunt's painting through two visibly open doors, through the gilded doorway-like frame and through the open doors of the altarpiece. This reframing, I believe, amplifies your argument that Christ knocks at the door but looks at us and invites us to become visionaries ourselves. Contemporary art historian Robert Nelson has argued that Damas's notion of Byzantine spatial icons is actually derived from scholarship on Dutch portrait paintings by another Austrian art historian, Alois Freeman, who similarly interpreted the gazes of portrait subjects as implicating the viewer. Nevertheless, I believe that Byzantine primary sources corroborate Damas's notion of monumental mosaics seeming to occupy the same space as the beholder. And here I wish to read a brief passage that also makes me think of Dr. Quash's discussion of Collingwood and Gadamer, who affirm both subjective experiences of the world as well as the possibility of publicly shared truths. In the late 12th or early 13th century description of the mosaics of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, a church official named Nicholas Mesorides described the experience of viewing the monumental mosaic of Christ Pantocrator in the dome. And I can't think of a more public image than the monumental image of Christ looking down. It actually had me thinking tonight about the Norman Adams painting in the sky, kind of looking, Christ looking down, which I wasn't familiar with, so I think it would have been explicit as well. Mesorides says, at its point of curvature, this dome depicts Christ, who was made man, peering over the rim of heaven, as it were, towards the floor of the nave and all that herein is. The look in his eyes is genial and friendly to those in possession of a clear conscience. His gaze is mild, gentleness itself. Though directed neither to the right nor to the left, it focuses at one and the same time on all and sundry and each individually. To those with a clear conscience, such as his gaze, but to those who stand self-condemned, it is angry, unwelcoming, and full of boding. His right hand is raised in blessing those who follow his right path, and reproving those who do not. In this text, Mesorides describes a monumental public artwork that can be seen by everyone who enters the church. And he describes the image of Christ as seeming to look at everyone in the church, all and sundry and each individually. But at the same time, he acknowledges the possibility of different subjective responses to the same artwork. The subjectivity of Byzantine responses to the icon of Christ in the church dome is apparent in other interpretations by different writers. In 864, Patriarch Photius described the mosaic of Christ in the dome of the Church of the Virgin of Dapharos in the imperial palace in Constantinople. Photius said, "On the very ceiling is painted in colored mosaic cubes a man-like figure bearing the traits of Christ. Thou mightest say he is overseeing the earth and dividing its orderly arrangement and government." This was in the palace. Here we see an icon of Christ as a kind of heavenly emperor, mirrored by the Roman emperor in the palace down below. In Byzantium, from the 8th century onward, the icon of Christ and the portrait of the emperor were quite literally on two sides of the same coin. Listening to Dr. Quash's talk tonight, I've also been thinking about how the appropriation or misappropriation of art by political figures or institutions complicates our relationship with beauty sometimes. You began your talk by acknowledging that one of the great dilemmas of the modern period is our loss of faith in the relationship between the good, the true, and the beautiful, and identified one reason, although you acknowledge there are many, for this loss of faith in our modern tendency to locate concepts like beauty in the eye of the beholder in our own minds, rather than out there, as it were, in an objective order of things. I also wonder how our modern skepticism toward a common sense of beauty is related to the common entanglements of beauty with institutions of power. To cite an example that is far more recent, closer to home than Photius on the Imperial Palace, we might consider Donald Trump's 2020 executive order, quote, executive order on promoting beautiful federal civic architecture in the United States, a kind of governmental mandate that we share common sense of beauty, in this case, mandating classical architecture. Or we might consider the vandalism and subsequent removal of monuments to slaveholders in the United States, particularly during the Black Lives Matter protests during the same year, 2020. And related to this, I've also been thinking about the persistent presence of ugliness alongside beauty in the history of art, and the relationship between ugliness with truth and goodness in our imperfect and, we might say, fallen world from a Christian perspective. Through the centuries, countless artists have created ugly or unsettling works in response to the horrors of war or other acts of brutality. I'm thinking, for example, although we could name any number of examples, of Goya's Disasters of War prints, works by German artists of the interwar period, Otto Dix, George Gross, Kate Kollwitz, which were responding to the horrors of World War I. We could talk about Picasso's Guernica, of course. Here in Canada, the contemporary Cree artist Ken Monkman has sought to respond to the history of colonialism and colonialist depictions of indigenous peoples with artworks that include portrayals of violence that are obviously intended to unsettle. In many of these works, beauty and ugliness coexist and even intersect, and I know this is something we've thought a lot about as well, and spoken about elsewhere. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the prominence of Christ's torture and death in the Christian artistic tradition. In many Gothic and Renaissance works, the ugliness of Christ's suffering appears to be the main subject. In Grunewald's well-known Isenheim altarpiece, for example, Christ's suffering is emphasized through exaggerated and contorted forms. Evidently, this emphasis on suffering reflects the fact that the altarpiece was created for a hospital where there were many sick and dying people. This was then a pastoral response to the sick and dying, a reminder that God too had come and suffered with humanity. In this poetic, Grunewald juxtaposes one of the most brutal images, perhaps the most brutal image of Christ's death ever produced, with a triumphantly luminous vision of Christ's resurrection. So I've been curious about the relationship between beauty and ugliness in art. But returning to the topic of the power of art to convert, this is where I'll conclude. I thought it would be nice to refer to a quotation from one of the great modern thinkers of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Pavel Florensky, who was a convert from atheism to Orthodox Christianity and eventually became a priest, and was ultimately killed at the hands of the Soviet authorities in 1937. Responding to the ongoing revitalization of icons in Russia in the early 20th century, and specifically to the restoration of the great 15th century icon of the Trinity by Andrei Rublev, Florensky commented, The most persuasive philosophic proof of God's existence is the one the textbooks never mention. There exists the icon of the Holy Trinity by St. Andrei Rublev, therefore God exists.
And if I could stand somewhere else, is that okay? Yeah. No. It's great. So if I could invite both of you back up, we'll have some conversation and some questions. I'd first love to give you, Ben, a chance to respond to Evan or say something in response to his questions.
Thank you. There's a wonderful set of questions. I won't explore all of them now, but I think to explore Holden's work in relation to and in comparison with the tradition of icons and Eastern Orthodoxy would be really interesting. I don't actually know the extent to which he acknowledged any kind of inspiration from that. It's certainly the case that many of the people who saw the work on its world tour proclaimed, I have seen Jesus. So whether at whatever level they were sort of tapping into that, what's quite a profound theology of the mediation of the person, that the hypostasis of Jesus is like that of the saints, and it looks like is actually the agent in the encounter through the work, and that at some level seems to confirm quite a deep orthodox theology of the icon. And that was on the part of those seeing it, not necessarily in Holden's own mind, but it may well have been in some way a part of what he was inspired by. The question of the relation of beauty to how should we put it, the appropriation of beauty by political agents who one may not approve of in other ways, and the question also of ugliness. They both raise, I think, a similar point, which is that the true form of beauty has to include this moral extension. That was one of the things that I was wanting to push towards in the paper, that beauty comes to a fuller expression, not merely when questions about proportion, colour, balance, all of those sorts of things, whether the pediment is the right size in relation to the pillars, are attended to, although that might well be a crucial part of what's attended to. But when the building that you have made in this way is also in service of the good, and that too is beautiful. I mean, that's where the convertibility comes in. So your lovely building is more beautiful, and perhaps only fully beautiful, when in the service of a flourishing, just public life. So to always push the idea of ratio, right relationship, beyond the aesthetic and into the moral, is to have an essential part of having a full enough account of beauty. And the ugly, I think, can be part of that. So the ugly, I think, can be part of that. So our medieval forebears certainly would have had quite a developed sense that at least the grotesque was part of a larger frame in which beauty is comprehended and responded to in ways that do justice also to the frightfulness of things. But because the frightfulness has its place in a larger providential order, it's possible to, in some way, incorporate the ugly. And I think I would like that. I'd like that to be a part of. That would need to be part of my answer. Although I think there are, and you beautifully illustrated that with Grunewald, because what's initially out of context perceived as simply horrific, in the context of the hospital and in the context of the other parts of the folding orderlies, becomes something even more beautiful. But there test cases, the really extreme cases that make that hard to affirm. But those are just some few brief thoughts I'd love to continue the conversation.